He was 72 hours into what should have been a 3-day supply run when the sky turned the color of old bruises and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than an hour. By the time Marcus Webb realized he was caught in a whiteout with nowhere to go, the only shelter visible through the screaming wind was the one place every local had warned him never to enter, the black mouth of Raven's Hollow Cave, and what he found inside would turn his simple mountain life into the biggest discovery in American criminal history. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The first flakes had started falling just after dawn, gentle and almost apologetic, dusting the shoulders of Marcus's worn canvas coat as he secured the last of the supplies to his pack frame. He'd been living in these mountains for nearly 11 years now, tucked into a cabin so remote that his nearest neighbor was a 14-mile hike through terrain that would make a mountain goat think twice. At 53 years old, Marcus Webb had the kind of face that looked carved from the same granite that jutted from these peaks, weathered, angular, and unimpressed by comfort or convenience. His beard, more salt than pepper now, hung thick against his chest, and his hands were the hands of a man who'd spent a lifetime working with wood, steel, and stone. He hadn't always lived like this. Once upon a time, Marcus had worn a tie to work, sat in traffic and worried about mortgage payments and performance reviews. He'd had a wife who loved him and a daughter who called him daddy with a lisp that made his heart squeeze every time. But that was before the accident, before the black ice and the guardrail that didn't hold, before the funeral where he stood between two closed caskets and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. The world had kept spinning after that, but Marcus had stepped off. He sold the house in Denver, sold the car, sold everything that reminded him of the life he'd built and lost. He took what money remained and bought 20 acres of nothing in the Montana wilderness, timber rights included, and built a cabin with his own 2 hands. That was 2011. He hadn't regretted it once. The mountains didn't ask questions. They didn't offer sympathy or tell him he needed to move on. They just were, solid and ancient and indifferent. And there was a comfort in that indifference that Marcus had never found among people. He trapped in the winter, fished in the summer, and kept a small garden that somehow survived despite the short growing season and his own questionable skills with anything that wasn't mechanical. Twice a month, weather permitting, he made the journey down to Coldwater Junction, a town so small it consisted of one general store, one bar, and a post office that doubled as a hardware shop. He'd pick up supplies, exchange brief pleasantries with whoever was working, and disappear back into the mountains before anyone could ask him to stay for coffee. It was a good life, a quiet life, the kind of life where a man could think or not think, where the loudest sound was usually the wind through the pines or the crack of a splitting log. Marcus had made his peace with solitude the way some men make peace with God, completely and without reservation. But peace doesn't stop a blizzard. By noon, the gentle snow had turned aggressive. The sky compressed into a low ceiling of slate gray, and the wind began to gust hard enough to make the trees groan. Marcus checked his compass, confirmed his heading, and picked up his pace. He'd been caught in weather before, had spent more than one night huddled under a lean-to made of pine boughs while a storm raged around him. But something about this felt different. The temperature was dropping faster than it should, and the wind had a teeth-baring quality that spoke of something worse coming. He was still 8 miles from his cabin when visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The world became a swirling white chaos, every direction identical, every landmark erased. Marcus stopped, forced himself to breathe slowly, and thought through his options. He could try to push forward, trusting his compass and his instincts, but in a whiteout like this, it would be easy to walk in circles, or worse, straight off a cliff he couldn't see until he was already falling. He could try to hunker down where he stood, build some kind of shelter, but the temperature was still dropping, and he could feel it even through his layers. The wind chill had to be pushing -50 by now, maybe worse. Or he could head east. He'd passed the landmarks 20 minutes before the visibility died, the split pine that looked like a tuning fork, the rock formation locals called the Three Sisters, and beyond that, maybe another quarter mile, the entrance to Raven's Hollow Cave. He'd seen it once before, years ago when he'd first started exploring this section of the mountains. The mouth of the cave was big enough to drive a truck through, and it cut deep into the mountainside, protected from the wind and weather. It was also, according to every old-timer in Coldwater Junction, cursed. The stories varied depending on who was telling them and how much whiskey they'd had, but the core narrative remained consistent. Bad things happened to people who went into Raven's Hollow. Hunters disappeared. Hikers came out confused and disoriented, talking about voices in the dark. One story claimed a group of miners in the 1800s had gone in looking for silver, and only one man came back out, white-haired and struck mute, unable or unwilling to explain what happened to his companions. Another version said the cave had been used by outlaws in the 1920s, and that the ghosts of men who'd been murdered over stolen gold still wandered the tunnels. Marcus didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in hypothermia, in frostbite, in the documented medical fact that a human body loses heat 25 times faster in wet clothing than dry, and that at a certain point, your brain stops working well enough to make good decisions. He believed in survival, and right now, survival meant shelter. He turned east and started walking. The wind tried to push him sideways, and the snow stung his exposed skin like thrown sand. He kept his head down, one hand on his compass, counting steps to maintain some sense of distance. 200 paces, 300. The world had become a roaring white tunnel, and Marcus existed at the center of it, alone and small and fighting for every forward step. Then, like a curtain pulled aside, the cave mouth appeared. It was exactly as he remembered. A ragged opening in the granite face of the mountain, roughly oval-shaped and tall enough that he didn't have to duck. The darkness inside looked solid compared to the chaos of the storm, and as Marcus stumbled forward into that darkness, the wind cut off so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical presence. He stood just inside the entrance, breathing hard, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Snow had plastered itself to his coat, his beard, even his eyebrows. He brushed it off with numb fingers and turned to look back at the storm. It raged just beyond the cave mouth like an animal that couldn't quite reach him, all fury and noise and zero effect. Safe, at least for now. Marcus unslung his pack and set it against the cave wall. His fingers were stiff with cold as he dug out his headlamp, clicked it on, and swept the beam around his shelter. The cave opened into a chamber maybe 30 feet across, the ceiling lost somewhere in the darkness overhead. The walls were rough granite, water-stained and scarred with centuries of freeze-thaw cycles. The floor was relatively flat, covered in a fine layer of dust and scattered with small rocks and the desiccated remains of what might have been pine needles or animal droppings, old enough to be dust themselves. No bones, no signs of previous occupants, human or otherwise, just a cave. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. So much for curses. He gathered some of the driest debris he could find and built a small fire just inside the entrance where the smoke would be pulled out by the wind. It took 3 tries with his lighter before the tinder caught, but once it did, the flames spread quickly and the light pushed back the darkness. Heat radiated outward, and Marcus held his hands close to the flames, feeling the painful tingle as circulation returned to his fingers. Outside, the storm continued to scream. Inside, Marcus was warm and dry and alive. He pulled out a vacuum-sealed pouch of venison jerky, tore it open and chewed slowly, letting his body settle, letting his mind catch up to the fact that he was safe. It was only then, in the quiet punctuated by the crackle of the fire, that Marcus noticed the draft. It came from deeper in the cave, a faint current of air that made the flames dance slightly. Caves didn't usually have drafts unless they connected to something, another entrance, a chimney to the surface, a network of tunnels. Marcus had explored a few caves over the years, nothing serious, just the kind of idle curiosity that comes with having time and wilderness in abundance. He knew enough to be cautious, knew about false floors and sudden drops and the way a person could get turned around in the dark and never find their way back out. But he also knew he might be here for a while. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and even after it passed, He'd need to wait for visibility to improve before attempting the hike back to his cabin. He had time, and he had light, and the alternative was sitting here staring at the cave wall. Marcus fed the fire until it was burning steadily, then stood and adjusted his headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a passage at the back of the main chamber. It was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, but tall enough to walk through without stooping. The draft was definitely coming from there, cool and steady. He walked forward slowly, testing each step before committing his weight. The passage sloped downward gently, the walls closing in slightly before opening up again into another chamber, this one smaller, roughly circular. His headlamp beam swept across the walls and Marcus stopped. There were markings, not natural formations or water stains, but deliberate marks carved into the stone. They weren't deep, just scratches really, but they formed patterns, lines, angles, something that might have been letters or symbols in a language Marcus didn't recognize. He stepped closer, running his fingers over the grooves. They were old, worn smooth by time, but unmistakably intentional. Someone had been here before, a long time before. Marcus continued deeper. The passage twisted, dropped another 10 feet or so, then opened into a third chamber. This one was different. The air smelled different here, less like stone and moisture and more like something else, something that made the back of Marcus's neck prickle with an instinct older than language. His headlamp caught something that didn't belong, a straight line in a place where nature didn't make straight lines. Marcus crossed the chamber in 4 long strides and stopped, staring. It was a crate. Military green, metal, stenciled with faded numbers and letters he couldn't quite make out in the dim light. It sat against the far wall, and now that he was looking for them, Marcus could see others. 3 more crates, all the same size, all bearing the same weathered stencils. His heart was beating faster now, a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the sudden understanding that he'd stumbled into something he didn't understand. Caves in the Montana wilderness didn't have military crates. They didn't have straight lines and stenciled numbers and the kind of deliberate placement that spoke of human intention. Marcus approached the nearest crate and knelt beside it. The metal was cold under his fingers and rust had eaten away at the corners, but the structure was still sound. There was a latch, simple and functional, and when Marcus tested it, the mechanism moved. Stiff, reluctant, but functional. He hesitated. Every instinct he'd developed over 11 years of living alone in the wilderness was screaming at him that this was the moment to walk away, to go back to his fire, to wait out the storm and pretend he'd never seen this. Whatever was in these crates had been hidden here deliberately, in a cave locals avoided, in a place so remote that the chances of anyone stumbling across it were astronomical. But Marcus had stopped listening to the part of himself that played it safe the day he'd buried his wife and daughter. He'd walked away from everything that mattered once before. He could open a damn crate. The latch released with a metallic groan that echoed in the chamber. Marcus lifted the lid, and his headlamp illuminated the contents. Paintings. They were wrapped in oilcloth, preserved with the kind of care that spoke to their value. Marcus lifted the first one out, carefully unfolding the protective layers, and found himself looking at an oil painting in an ornate gilt frame. The subject was a woman in 18th century dress, her expression serene, the brushwork so delicate that Marcus could see individual strands of hair. He wasn't an art expert, had never set foot in a gallery in his life, but even he could recognize that this was something special, something old, something valuable, something that belonged in a museum, not a cave in Montana. Marcus set it aside carefully and reached for the next painting, then the next. 5 paintings in the first crate, each one wrapped with the same meticulous care, each one clearly worth a fortune. He moved to the second crate, fumbled with the latch and found more paintings. The third crate held sculptures, small bronze figures, marble busts, pieces that even in the uncertain light of his headlamp gleamed with the patina of age and craftsmanship. The fourth crate was different. When Marcus opened it, he found documents, files, thick manila folders bound with string, their edges yellowed with age. He pulled one out, untied the string, and began to read. The first page was a newspaper clipping from 1973, the headline stark even 40-some years later. Museum heist nets millions in art. Below it, another clipping. FBI expands search for stolen masterpieces. And another. Still no leads in historic art theft. Marcus's hands weren't quite steady as he flipped through the file. There were photographs, black and white, showing empty frames on museum walls. There were inventory lists, detailed descriptions of stolen items. There were FBI reports, witness statements, and at the very bottom of the folder, a handwritten note on paper so old it crackled when Marcus unfolded it. If you're reading this, I'm dead. The items in this cache represent 73 pieces stolen from the Gardner Museum and 12 other institutions between 1971 and 1976. Total estimated value as of 1978, $82 million. I couldn't fence them, too hot, too recognizable. So I buried them where no one would look, where the ghosts could keep them safe. Let the world think they burned or were cut from their frames. Let them stay lost. Better lost than sold to men worse than me. J.R. Marcus read it twice, then a third time. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was looking at, what it meant. $82 million in 1978. Adjusted for inflation, accounting for increased art values, the current worth would be astronomical. 300 million, 400 million, maybe more. He was sitting in a cave with what might be the single largest cache of stolen art in American history. And no one knew it was here. Marcus sat back on his heels, the note still in his hand, and listened to the silence of the cave. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but in here, in this chamber deep in the mountain, time seemed to have stopped somewhere around 1978 and never started again. These paintings, these sculptures, they'd been waiting in the dark for over 40 years, waiting for someone to find them, or waiting to stay lost forever. The draft stirred the edges of the oilcloth, and Marcus realized his fire back at the cave entrance would be dying by now. He needed to go back, feed it, keep warm. But his legs didn't want to move. His brain was stuck on the implications, on the sheer impossibility of what he'd found. Someone had pulled off one of the biggest art heists in history. Someone named J.R. had stolen millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable art and brought it here, to this cave, to this mountain, and then died without telling anyone where it was. The museums had never recovered their pieces. The FBI had never closed the case. Insurance companies had paid out fortunes. And all along, it had been here, hidden in a place protected by nothing more than local superstition and extraordinary bad luck for anyone who might have wandered in. Until Marcus. He stood slowly, his knees creaking, and looked around the chamber with new eyes. There might be more. If there were 4 crates in this chamber, there might be others deeper in the cave. More art, more documents, more pieces of a puzzle that the world had given up trying to solve decades ago. But it was also getting colder. He could feel it, even through his coat, the kind of deep cold that settled into your bones and didn't leave. He needed to get back to the fire, needed to warm up and think and decide what to do with this information. Marcus carefully closed the crates, leaving everything as he'd found it except for the single folder of documents he tucked into his coat. Evidence, proof that what he'd seen was real and not some hypothermia-induced hallucination. He took one last look around the chamber, committing the layout to memory, then turned and made his way back through the passage. The fire had burned down to coals, but it was the work of minutes to build it back up. Marcus fed it carefully, watching the flames grow, and then he sat with his back against the cave wall and pulled out the folder. He read every page, studied every photograph, absorbed every detail of a crime that had happened before he'd even met his wife, before his daughter had been born, before any of the life he'd built and lost had even existed. 73 pieces, museums in Boston, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer, sketches by Degas, sculptures by Rodin, the kind of art that art historians wrote entire books about, that people traveled across countries to see. All of it gone in a series of coordinated thefts that had been so clean, so professional, that the FBI had suspected inside help from the start. They'd arrested suspects over the years, brought charges, but nothing stuck. No one talked. No one knew where the art had gone. The prevailing theory had been that it was fenced overseas, cut from frames, sold to private collectors who didn't care about provenance as long as they owned something no one else could have. But JR hadn't sold it. JR had hidden it, brought it to one of the most remote places on the continent, and left it to gather dust while the world searched in vain. Marcus closed the folder and stared into the fire. Outside, the storm was finally showing signs of weakening. The wind had dropped from a scream to a howl, and through the cave mouth he could see that the snow was falling more gently now, thick flakes instead of horizontal needles. By morning he'd be able to leave. The question was, what did he do with what he'd found? He could walk away, close the crates, leave everything exactly as it was, hike back to his cabin, and never speak of it. The art had survived 40+ years in the cave. It would survive longer. Eventually, someone else might find it, or the mountain might claim it through rockfall or flooding, but it wouldn't be Marcus's problem. He could report it. Contact the FBI, tell them what he'd found, and let the professionals handle it. There would be questions, investigations, probably a media circus. His face would be on the news, his name in the papers. The quiet life he'd built would evaporate like morning mist, and he'd be thrust back into a world of people and noise and expectations he'd left behind for good reason. Or he could take it. The thought came unbidden, and Marcus pushed it away immediately, but it came back, persistent. 4 crates, maybe more. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Even a single painting could set him up for life, could buy comfort he'd long since stopped thinking about. He could sell it quietly, through channels that didn't ask questions, and live out his days in complete security. But that would make him a thief. The original thief was dead, the statute of limitations on the actual burglary had probably run out, but the art still belonged to someone. Museums, insurance companies, the public trust. Taking it would be wrong in a way that had nothing to do with legality and everything to do with the code Marcus had always lived by, even when living by it cost him everything. He'd been a good man once, a good husband, a good father, a good employee. The accident hadn't been his fault, the ice had been black and invisible, and the guardrail had failed. But he'd been driving. He'd been the one who survived when his wife and daughter hadn't, and that guilt had carved out a hollow place in his chest that 11 years hadn't filled. He'd come to these mountains to escape that guilt, to live simply and cause no harm, to exist without taking more than he needed, or leaving scars he couldn't heal. Finding this cache, this was the universe testing him, asking him what kind of man he was when no one was watching, when the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. Marcus fed the fire one more time, wrapped himself in his sleeping bag, and lay down to sleep. Tomorrow he'd hike out. Tomorrow he'd make his decision. But tonight, while the storm finished dying and the mountain settled around him, he let himself simply exist in the space between finding and choosing, where the weight of $400 million in stolen art pressed down on him like the snow pressing down on the mountain above. He dreamed of his daughter. She was 7 again, gap-toothed and laughing, showing him a drawing she'd made in school. In the dream, he couldn't quite see what she'd drawn, couldn't make out the details no matter how hard he tried to focus. But he could hear her voice, bright and clear and impossible. "What are you going to do, Daddy?" When he woke, the fire was ash, the cave was silent, and through the mouth of Raven's Hollow, dawn was breaking over a world buried in fresh snow. The morning light filtered into Raven's Hollow cave like something tentative, uncertain if it was welcome. Marcus woke with his back aching and his breath visible in the frigid air. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. He sat up slowly, his joints protesting, and looked toward the cave entrance where sunlight painted the fresh snow in shades of gold and pink. He should leave, pack up, hike back to his cabin, return to the life he'd built in careful isolation. But his eyes kept drifting toward the dark passage at the back of the chamber, toward the crates and their impossible contents waiting in the darkness below. Marcus made coffee on his small camp stove, the familiar ritual grounding him while his mind spun through possibilities. The folder of documents sat beside him, and he found himself reading through it again, this time paying attention to details he'd missed in his initial shock. There were names mentioned in the FBI reports, people questioned and released, dead ends and cold trails. One name appeared more frequently than others. Joseph Raines, a security consultant who'd worked at 3 of the targeted museums in the early 1970s. Questioned multiple times, never charged, disappeared from public record in 1977. J.R. Joseph Raines. Marcus sipped his coffee and thought about a man who'd pulled off the heist of the century and then buried his prize in a Montana cave. What kind of person did that? What combination of greed and guilt, ambition and fear led someone to hide hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art where no one, including themselves, could ever benefit from it? The answer was in the note. Better lost than sold to men worse than me. Whatever Joseph Raines had been, thief, criminal, sociopath, he'd drawn a line somewhere. He'd stolen from institutions, but he wouldn't sell to people he considered worse than himself. Organized crime, maybe. Foreign governments. Private collectors whose money came from sources even a career criminal found distasteful. So he'd chosen a third option, bury it all and let it disappear from history. But now Marcus knew where it was. Now the choice was his. He finished his coffee, packed his gear with methodical precision, and made a decision. Before he left, before he hiked back to civilization and decided what to do with this knowledge, he needed to know exactly what he was dealing with. If there were more crates, more art, more pieces to this puzzle, he needed to see them. Not out of greed, he told himself, but out of thoroughness. You couldn't make an informed decision without complete information. Marcus lit his headlamp and descended back into the cave. The second chamber looked different in the morning light that filtered down from above, less ominous and more mundane. The markings on the walls were still there, still mysterious, but they no longer seemed threatening, just old, carved by someone long dead for reasons that died with them. He moved through quickly, descended to the third chamber where the 4 crates sat waiting. But now, with fresh eyes and deliberate attention, Marcus noticed something he'd missed the night before. The third chamber wasn't the end. There was another passage, narrower than the first, partially hidden behind a fold in the rock wall. The draft he'd felt the night before was stronger here, cold air flowing from somewhere deeper in the mountain. Marcus squeezed through the gap, his pack scraping against stone, and found himself in a tunnel that dropped more steeply than the previous passages. He moved carefully, testing each foothold, using his hands against the walls for balance. The tunnel curved, narrowed further, then suddenly opened into a space so large his headlamp couldn't find the far walls. This wasn't a chamber. This was a cavern. Marcus stood at the entrance, sweeping his light across a space that must have been 100 feet across, and at least that tall. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone teeth, and the floor was relatively flat, covered in fine sand that might have been deposited by an ancient underground river. And scattered across that floor, arranged with obvious care, were more crates. Marcus counted them as he walked forward, 8, 12, 15, 20. They were identical to the ones in the third chamber, military green metal boxes with faded stencils. But these weren't arranged against walls or stacked casually. They were positioned in rows, evenly spaced, like Joseph Raines had been creating a gallery in the dark. Marcus opened the nearest crate with hands that shook slightly. More paintings, these even more carefully preserved than the first batch. He recognized one of them, a Vermeer, girl reading a letter at an open window. He'd seen it in a book once, years ago, before his old life ended. The book had said it hung in a gallery in Dresden. Apparently, that information was outdated. The next crate held sculptures, the one after that held what appeared to be ancient artifacts, pottery and jewelry that looked Greek or Roman, pieces that belonged in the British Museum or the Louvre. Marcus moved from crate to crate, opening them methodically, cataloguing contents that grew more impossible with each discovery. There were paintings he recognized even with his limited knowledge, a Rembrandt self-portrait, a Monet water lily study, a Van Gogh landscape that made something in his chest ache with its brutal beauty. There were sculptures by Bernini and Rodin, Sketches by Da Vinci and Michelangelo, illuminated manuscripts so old the vellum crackled when he carefully lifted the protective cloth. This wasn't just the Gardner Museum heist. This was a lifetime of theft, decades of systematic looting from museums and private collections across multiple continents. Joseph Raines hadn't been some opportunistic burglar. He'd been a professional, probably one of the best in the world, and he'd spent his entire criminal career acquiring pieces that he then buried in a cave in Montana. The scope of it was staggering. Marcus had to sit down on one of the crates, his legs suddenly unreliable. He pulled out a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket and started making a list, not of every item that would take days, but of the highlights. The pieces he recognized, the ones he could identify from the stencils on the crates, the rough count of containers. 37 crates in total. Conservative estimate based on what he'd seen so far. 300 to 400 individual pieces. Current value he couldn't even begin to calculate. The Vermeer alone was probably worth 50 million. The Da Vinci sketches, possibly more. The ancient artifacts, priceless in the truest sense of the word. He was sitting in a cave with what might be the greatest concentration of stolen art in human history. And the only person who knew about it was a 53-year-old hermit who'd come here by accident, running from a storm. Marcus laughed, a short bark of sound that echoed in the cavern and came back to him sounding slightly hysterical. This was insane. This was impossible. This was the kind of discovery that would make headlines around the world, that would spark international incidents, that would rewrite art history and museum security protocols, and probably launch a dozen different investigations. And it was his, at least for now. His secret, his burden, his choice. He stood up, closed the crate he'd been sitting on, and continued his survey. Some of the crates had documents tucked inside, provenance files that Joseph Raines had apparently kept meticulously. Marcus skimmed through them, learning the history of thefts that spanned from 1968 to 1977. Paris, London, New York, Tokyo, Rome. Raines had hit them all, sometimes working alone, sometimes with partners who were only identified by initials or code names. In one file, Marcus found photographs, not of art, but of people. Joseph Raines himself, a thin man with sharp features and eyes that looked tired even when he was smiling. There were pictures of him at what looked like gallery openings, blending in with the wealthy and cultured, studying his targets. Pictures of him with various associates, their faces carefully blurred or cut out of the frame, protecting their identities even in private documentation. And at the bottom of the stack, a picture that made Marcus stop breathing. It was Raines again, older now, maybe in his 50s, but he wasn't alone. He was standing in front of this very cave. Marcus recognized the distinctive rock formation around the entrance, and beside him was a woman, young, maybe 30, with dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. On the back of the photo, written in the same handwriting as the note Marcus had found, Sarah, last trip, spring 1978. She understands now why it has to stay buried. Sarah. A partner? A daughter? Someone Raines had trusted enough to show the cash, to share the secret of where he'd hidden his life's work. Marcus flipped through the remaining documents, looking for more mentions of Sarah, but found nothing. Just that one photo, that one cryptic note, which meant someone else knew about this place, or had known 40-some years ago. Whether Sarah was still alive, whether she remembered, whether she'd kept the secret, Marcus had no way of knowing. But the possibility that he wasn't the only living person aware of Raven's Hollow's contents added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Marcus spent another hour in the cavern, methodically checking every crate, taking notes, trying to build a complete picture of what he was dealing with. By the time he finished, his notebook was full of entries, and his understanding of the magnitude of his discovery had expanded beyond anything he'd initially imagined. The conservative estimate, based on auction records he vaguely remembered and values he could only guess at, put the total worth somewhere north of $380 million. Maybe more. Maybe significantly more if any of these pieces had been written off as destroyed or lost forever, which would increase their value through sheer rarity. $380 million. The number didn't feel real. It was too large, too abstract. Marcus tried to imagine what that kind of money meant, what it could buy, what it could do, but his mind couldn't grasp it. He'd been living on roughly $12,000 a year for the last decade, trapping and fishing and doing odd jobs when he needed cash. The gap between 12,000 and 380 million was so vast it might as well have been the distance to the moon. What happens next will test everything he believes about right and wrong, reveal a decades-old conspiracy, and force a man who wanted nothing from the world to make the hardest choice of his life. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Marcus climbed back up to the entrance chamber, his mind churning. The sun was higher now, and the temperature had risen enough that the snow on the ground was starting to develop a crust. Good hiking weather. If he left now, he could make it back to his cabin before dark. He could lock the door, start a fire, and pretend the last 18 hours had been a dream brought on by hypothermia and exhaustion. But he couldn't. Because it wasn't a dream, and pretending wouldn't change the fact that he now carried knowledge that changed everything. Marcus stood at the cave entrance, looking out at the pristine snow and the mountains beyond, and thought about responsibility. He'd spent 11 years avoiding it, refusing to engage with a world that had taken everything he loved and given nothing back but pain. He'd built a life predicated on the idea that if he wanted nothing, needed nothing, connected to nothing, then nothing could hurt him again. But this cash, these stolen treasures, they connected him whether he wanted it or not. They were a responsibility he couldn't ignore, a weight he couldn't shrug off. Because they weren't his, and they weren't Joseph Raines's, and they weren't meant to sit in a cave until the mountain reclaimed them. They belonged to the world, to the museums they'd been stolen from, to the people who should be able to see them and study them and be moved by them. Marcus thought about his daughter. She would have been 24 now if she'd lived, probably graduated from college, maybe starting a career or traveling or falling in love. He tried to imagine what she would have become, what kind of woman would have grown from that gap-toothed 7-year-old, but the images wouldn't come. She existed in his memory as she'd been, frozen at 7, forever asking him to look at her drawings and listen to her stories. What would she think of him now? What would she say about a father who found stolen art and had to choose between self-preservation and doing the right thing? He knew the answer. She'd been the kind of kid who cried when other kids got hurt, who gave away her lunch to classmates who forgot theirs, who believed in fairness with the absolute certainty that only children possess. She would tell him to return it, to give it back, to make sure the paintings went home where they belonged. But she was dead, and he was alive, and the choice was his alone. Marcus packed his gear, made sure the fire was completely out, and took one last look into the depths of Raven's Hollow. Then he stepped out into the snow and started the long hike back to his cabin. The journey took 6 hours, breaking trail through knee-deep powder, navigating by landmarks he knew by heart. The physical exertion was welcome, giving his body something to do while his mind wrestled with impossible questions. By the time his cabin came into view, a small dark square against the white landscape, Marcus had made exactly 0 decisions and exhausted himself completely. He spent the evening going through his minimal supplies, checking what needed to be restocked, doing the small maintenance tasks that kept her off-grid life functional. Normal things, familiar rhythms, anything to avoid thinking about what sat waiting in the cave 8 miles to the east. But when he finally lay down to sleep, his mind betrayed him, replaying images of paintings and sculptures, numbers and possibilities, choices and consequences. The next morning, Marcus woke with clarity he hadn't felt in years. He knew what he had to do. He didn't want to do it, every instinct screamed against it, but he knew. He had to tell someone, not the FBI, not yet. Not the authorities who would swarm the cave and turn his mountains into a circus, but someone who could help him navigate what came next, someone who understood art and theft and the complicated machinery of justice, someone he could trust. The problem was, Marcus didn't trust anyone. He'd spent 11 years specifically avoiding trust, avoiding connection, avoiding any relationship that might lead to the kind of loss he'd experienced before. He had no friends, no family he was in contact with, no network to lean on. Except there was one person. Maybe. Marcus dug through a box of old papers he kept under his bed, remnants of his previous life he'd never quite managed to throw away. He found what he was looking for near the bottom, a Christmas card from 3 years ago, forwarded to him from his old address in Denver. It was from Catherine Price, his wife's best friend from college, an art historian who'd given the eulogy at the funeral and told Marcus to call if he ever needed anything. He'd never called, never written back. Never acknowledged the card or the dozen others she'd sent over the years, her handwriting getting more resigned with each attempt at connection. The last one had simply said, "Still here if you need me. Still your friend, even if you've forgotten. Cat." Marcus stared at the card, at the Boston return address, at handwriting that belonged to someone from a life he'd worked hard to forget. Catherine Price. Dr. Catherine Price, if he remembered correctly. She'd gotten her PhD somewhere prestigious, Harvard or Yale. She worked for a museum now, he thought, or maybe a university. Someone who would know about stolen art, about provenance and recovery, about what to do when you stumbled across the greatest art heist in history. Someone who might still consider him a friend, despite years of silence. Marcus had no phone, no internet, no way to contact the outside world from his cabin. Which meant he needed to hike to Coldwater Junction, to the general store where they had a payphone and spotty cell service, and make a call he'd been avoiding for over a decade. He waited 2 more days, telling himself he needed to prepare, to think through what he'd say, but really just postponing the inevitable. Finally, on a clear morning with the sky so blue it hurt to look at, Marcus packed a small bag and started the 14-mile hike to town. Coldwater Junction looked exactly as it always did. Shabby, half-abandoned, clinging to existence through sheer stubbornness. The general store was open. The same teenage kid behind the counter that was always behind the counter, playing on his phone and not looking up when the bell rang. Marcus bought a prepaid calling card, fed quarters into the ancient payphone outside, and dialed the number from the Christmas card. It rang 4 times, and he was about to hang up when someone answered. "Hello?" A woman's voice, older than he remembered, but unmistakably Catherine. Marcus's throat closed. He hadn't spoken to anyone from his old life since the funeral, hadn't heard a voice that connected him to his wife and daughter, and suddenly it was too much. "Hello?" Catherine repeated. "If this is a telemarketer, I'm really not interested." "Cat," his voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. "It's Marcus." The silence on the other end stretched so long he thought she'd hung up. Then, "Marcus Webb?" "Yeah." Another pause. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, I thought you were dead." "Not yet." "Where are you? Are you okay? Do you need help?" The questions came rapid fire, concern and shock and something else in her voice, relief maybe, or anger at years of silence. Marcus leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the phone box. "I'm okay. I'm in Montana, but I need to talk to you about something important." "Okay." Catherine's voice shifted, became more controlled, the professional tone she probably used with students or colleagues. "What's going on?" Marcus looked around the empty street, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the normal world that had no idea what was hidden in those peaks. "Not over the phone. Is there any way you could come here? Or I could come to you? I know it's asking a lot after all this time, but I wouldn't ask if it wasn't critical." "You're scaring me, Marcus. I'm sorry, I don't mean to. But what I found, it's not something I can explain in a phone call. And you're the only person I can think of who might understand, who might know what to do." He heard rustling on the other end, papers maybe, or Catherine checking a calendar. "I'm teaching this semester, but I have spring break in 2 weeks. I could fly to Montana, meet you somewhere. Where's the nearest airport?" "Missoula, probably. But Kat, when you come, don't tell anyone where you're going or why. And don't mention my name to anyone." The silence that followed was heavy with unasked questions. Finally, Catherine said, "You found something illegal." "I found something that's been illegal since before I met you. Something that people have been looking for since 1973. And if the wrong people find out I know where it is, I'm not sure what happens next. 1973. Catherine's voice changed again, became sharp with sudden understanding. Marcus, what exactly did you find? Art, he said simply. A lot of it, more than you can imagine, and I think I need help figuring out how to give it back. He could hear Catherine breathing, processing, connecting dots he couldn't see. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but intense. Okay, I'll be there. 2 weeks, Missoula Airport. Call me when you can and give me details about where to meet you. And Marcus, be careful. If you found what I think you found, you're right to be scared. People have killed for less. They said goodbye, and Marcus hung up, feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. He'd taken the first step, reached out, connected with another human being for the first time in years. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next, he was committed to seeing it through. He bought supplies at the general store, the teenager ringing him up without comment or curiosity, and started the long hike back to his cabin. The mountains embraced him as they always did, indifferent and eternal, keeping their secrets the way they'd kept Joseph Raines's secret for over 40 years. But secrets had a way of coming out eventually. Marcus understood that now. The question was whether he could control how this one emerged, whether he could guide it towards something like justice, or whether it would explode in ways he couldn't predict or contain. That night, back in his cabin, Marcus sat at his small table and wrote everything down. Every detail of the cave, every item he'd catalogued, every thought he'd had about what to do next. He wrote until his hand cramped, until he'd filled a dozen pages of his notebook with information that would either save him or destroy him. Then he hid the notebook in a waterproof bag, hiked a mile from his cabin, and buried it at the base of a lightning-struck pine tree he'd used as a landmark for years. If something happened to him before Catherine arrived, someone would eventually find the notebook. Probably. Maybe. It was the best insurance he could manage. The 2 weeks before Catherine's arrival crawled by. Marcus tried to maintain his normal routine, checking his trap lines, chopping wood, repairing a section of roof that had started leaking. But normal felt like a costume he was wearing badly, and the knowledge of what waited in Raven's Hollow pressed on him like the weight of the mountain itself. He dreamed every night, vivid, complicated dreams where his daughter walked through galleries filled with stolen paintings, pointing at each one and asking him where it came from, why it was there, what he was going to do about it. He'd wake in darkness, heart pounding, and lie awake until dawn painted the windows grey. 5 days before Catherine was due to arrive, Marcus made one more trip to the cave. He told himself it was to verify his memories, to make sure he hadn't imagined or exaggerated what he'd found. But really, he needed to see it again, to confirm that it was real, that he wasn't making the hardest choice of his life over a hallucination or a misunderstanding. The cave was exactly as he'd left it. The crates sat in their ordered rows, the paintings hung in their careful wrappings, and the fortune in stolen art waited patiently in the dark. Marcus spent an hour making additional notes, taking more detailed inventory, building the case he'd need to make when Catherine arrived and the real work began. As he was preparing to leave, something made him pause. A feeling, irrational and impossible, that he wasn't alone. Marcus turned slowly, sweeping his headlamp across the cavern. But there was nothing. Just shadows and stone and the patient artifacts of Joseph Raines's criminal career. But the feeling persisted. Someone was watching, or had been watching, or would be watching. The hair on the back of Marcus's neck stood up, and he found himself thinking of the photo he'd found, of Sarah with her almost smile, of the possibility that he wasn't the only person who knew this secret. He left the cave quickly, not quite running, but moving faster than the terrain required. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and clean, and Marcus stood in it for a long moment, letting the light burn away the irrational fear. No one knew he was here. No one had followed him. He was alone, as he'd been alone for 11 years, and that was both his safety and his curse. Marcus hiked back to his cabin, marked off another day on the calendar he'd started keeping, and waited for Catherine Price to arrive and change everything. The Missoula airport was smaller than Marcus remembered airports being, though to be fair, He hadn't been in one since 2010. He stood near the baggage claim, shoulders hunched, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, feeling exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. Too many people, too much noise, too many eyes that might look at him and see something worth noticing. Catherine's flight was delayed by 40 minutes, which gave Marcus plenty of time to second-guess every decision that had led him here. He could still leave, walk out to the parking lot, climb into the battered truck he'd borrowed from an acquaintance in Coldwater Junction who asked no questions, and disappear back into his mountains. Catherine would wait, eventually give up, fly home, and his life would return to its carefully constructed isolation. But then passengers started emerging from the security checkpoint, and Marcus saw her. She'd aged, of course. 11 years had turned the woman in his memories from late 30s to late 40s, had added grey to her dark hair and lines around her eyes. But she still moved with the same purposeful energy he remembered from the handful of times they'd met before everything fell apart. Academic conferences where his wife had dragged him along, dinner parties where he'd felt perpetually out of place among people who spoke 3 languages and had opinions about postmodern theory. Catherine saw him at the same moment, and her expression cycled through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been grief before settling on determined warmth. She crossed the space between them in a dozen strides and pulled him into a hug before he could protest or prepare. "You look like hell," she said against his shoulder. "You look good," Marcus replied, because it was true and because he didn't know what else to say. She pulled back, studying his face with the intensity of someone trained to analyze details. "When's the last time you ate a real meal, or talked to another human being, or had a haircut?" "It's been a while." Catherine shook her head, grabbed her single carry-on bag, and gestured toward the exit. "Okay, feed me, tell me where we're going, and then explain to me what's so important that you broke radio silence after over a decade." They found a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since breakfast. Marcus ordered without looking at the menu. Catherine got a salad she picked at while watching him with eyes that saw too much. "So," she said after the waitress had refilled their coffee for the second time. "Art, a lot of it. Hidden since 1973. Want to narrow that down for me?" Marcus pulled the notebook from his coat pocket, the same one he'd filled in the days after finding the cave, and slid it across the table. Catherine opened it, started reading, and went very still. Are you saying you found the Gardner pieces?" "Among others, a lot of others." "How many is a lot?" 37 crates, maybe $380 million worth, conservative estimate." Catherine set down her coffee cup carefully, like she was afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment. "You're not joking." "I don't joke anymore." She read through the notebook in silence, flipping pages, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief or recognition. When she finished, she closed it, folded her hands on top, and looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't read. "Okay," she said. "I believe you. Partly because you have no reason to lie, and partly because some of these pieces match items I've researched. There's been speculation for years that the Gardner heist was connected to other thefts from the same period, but no one could prove it. If what you're saying is true, if you've actually found this cache, it's Marcus, it's the discovery of the century. Maybe multiple centuries." "I know." "And you want to return it?" "Yes." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Because it's not mine. Because it belongs to museums, to the public. Because keeping it would be wrong." Catherine leaned back in the booth, still watching him. "A lot of people would take it, sell it piece by piece, live like kings for the rest of their lives. No one knows you found it. No one's looking for it anymore. You could walk away rich." "I know," Marcus said again. "I thought about it. But my daughter, she wouldn't have wanted that. She believed in doing the right thing, even when it cost you." Something shifted in Catherine's expression, softened. Sarah was a good kid. Hearing his daughter's name spoken aloud by someone who'd known her, who remembered her as a real person and not just a ghost in Marcus's memory, hit harder than he'd expected. He had to look away, focusing on the coffee cooling in his cup. She was, he managed, and I've spent 11 years hiding from everything because I couldn't handle losing her. But finding this, it feels like maybe I'm supposed to do something that matters, something she'd be proud of. Catherine reached across the table and squeezed his hand, brief and warm, then withdrew. Okay, then we do this right. But Marcus, you need to understand what we're walking into. The Gardner theft alone, never mind the rest, has been investigated by the FBI for over 50 years. There are task forces, insurance companies, private investigators, not to mention criminals who might still be interested in the pieces. Once we report this, your life changes completely. You'll be questioned, investigated, probably followed by media for months. Your quiet mountain existence, gone. I know. And you're still willing to do it? Marcus thought about the cave, about paintings that deserved to be seen and sculptures that belonged in galleries where people could stand in front of them and feel something larger than themselves. He thought about Joseph Raines, who'd stolen beauty and then buried it, who'd chosen to let it die rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. He thought about his daughter, 7 years old forever, asking him what he was going to do. I'm willing, he said. They drove north from Missoula in the borrowed truck, Catherine asking questions while Marcus navigated roads that got progressively worse the deeper they went into the wilderness. She wanted to know everything: how he'd found the cave, what exactly he'd seen, whether anyone else knew about it, what security, if any, protected the site. Marcus answered as completely as he could, but there were gaps in his knowledge, things he hadn't thought to check or document. Catherine made notes in a small leather journal, her handwriting precise and academic, already building what Marcus assumed was some kind of strategy for how to handle the recovery. We need to document everything before we report it, she said, as they turned onto a dirt road that didn't appear on any map Marcus had ever seen. Photographs, detailed inventory, chain of custody documentation. The moment we tell the authorities, they'll swarm the site. We need to control the narrative as much as possible, make sure credit goes where it's due and that the recovery is handled properly. I don't care about credit. Maybe not, but I do. You found this, Marcus. You made the choice to report it instead of profiting from it. That means something, and it needs to be part of the record. They reached Coldwater Junction as the sun was setting, and Marcus pointed out the general store where he'd made the phone call that started all this. Catherine studied the tiny town with what looked like bemused fascination. You've been living near here for 11 years. 14 miles that way. Marcus gestured toward the mountains. No neighbors, no roads, just me in the woods. That sounds terrible. Marcus smiled slightly. It was exactly what I needed. They spent the night in the truck's cab, parked behind the general store where the teenager who worked there wouldn't notice or care. Marcus had slept in worse places, and Catherine seemed determined to prove she could handle roughing it, despite her obvious unfamiliarity with the concept. In the morning they bought supplies, coffee and energy bars and water, and started the hike to Raven's Hollow. The journey took most of the day. Catherine was in decent shape, but she wasn't accustomed to the elevation or the terrain, and they had to stop frequently for rest. Marcus used the time to tell her about Joseph Raines, about the documents he'd found, about the photo of Sarah and the implication that someone else had known about the cash. That worries me, Catherine admitted, as they paused on a ridge overlooking a valley filled with pine trees. If there's even a chance someone else knows about this location, we need to move fast. Once we report it, there's going to be a window between announcement and security where the site is vulnerable. You think someone might try to steal it again? I think $380 million is motive for a lot of bad behavior. We need to be smart about this. They reached the cave as afternoon shadows were lengthening across the snow. Marcus stood at the entrance, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't expected. This was it, the moment where his secret became shared, where the burden he'd been carrying alone got distributed to someone else. Catherine seemed to sense his hesitation. We don't have to do this today. We can wait, come back tomorrow with fresh energy. No, Marcus said. I want you to see it. I need you to see it, to confirm I'm not crazy, that this is as big as I think it is." They entered the cave together, and Marcus led Catherine through the familiar passages, pointing out the markings on the walls, the draft that had first drawn him deeper, the careful descent into the earth. When they reached the third chamber with its 4 crates, Catherine stopped and stared. "My God," she whispered, "you weren't exaggerating. It gets bigger." He showed her through to the main cavern, and when his headlamp illuminated the rows of crates arranged like exhibits in a gallery only ghosts could visit, Catherine actually gasped. She moved forward slowly, reverently, her fingers trailing over the stenciled markings on the nearest container. "Can I?" she asked, gesturing to the latch. "That's why you're here." Catherine opened the crate with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a career handling valuable art, and when she pulled back the protective wrapping to reveal the painting inside, her hands started shaking. "This is the Vermeer, the actual Vermeer. I wrote my dissertation on this painting, on the symbolism of light in his domestic scenes, and it's right here." She looked at Marcus, her eyes bright with tears. "Do you have any idea what this means? This painting was stolen in 1974 from a private collection in Amsterdam. It's been presumed destroyed for decades, and it's perfect, completely intact. The preservation is miraculous." "There's more," Marcus said quietly. They spent the next 3 hours going through the crates systematically. Catherine examined each piece with expert attention, making notes, taking photographs with a professional-grade camera she'd brought, occasionally making sounds of amazement or disbelief. She found pieces she recognized, pieces she'd only seen in photographs or read about in academic papers, pieces the art world had mourned as lost forever. "The scope of this is beyond anything I imagined," she said finally, sitting back on one of the crates with exhaustion written across her face. "This isn't just the Gardner heist. This is a systematic raid on the world's cultural heritage spanning at least a decade. Rains must have had connections everywhere. Forgers for documentation, transportation networks, storage facilities. This represents a level of criminal sophistication that's almost unprecedented. But we can return it, right? We can get it back to where it belongs?" Catherine nodded slowly. "Yes. But Marcus, the logistics are going to be complicated. Some of these pieces belong to museums that no longer exist. Some were owned privately by people who've since died. Insurance companies paid out on claims decades ago, which means they technically own the pieces now. International law gets involved because the thefts crossed borders. This is going to take years to sort out completely." "But they'll go back to museums eventually? People will be able to see them?" "Most of them, yes. It'll require negotiations, legal agreements, probably some political maneuvering. But the art world is going to be thrilled, and institutions will fall over themselves to display pieces they thought were gone forever." She paused. "You're going to be famous, you know, the man who found the lost masterpieces. There'll be books, documentaries, probably a movie." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "I don't want that." "I know, but it's coming anyway. The best we can do is try to manage it, control the story as much as possible, which is why we need to be strategic about how we announce this." They talked through options as they made their way back up to the cave entrance. Catherine argued for bringing in the FBI immediately, for official documentation and protection. Marcus worried about losing control of the narrative, about being swallowed by an investigation he didn't understand. They compromised. Catherine would make initial contact with a specific FBI art crimes agent she knew and trusted, someone who would understand the sensitivity of the situation and respect Marcus's desire for privacy as much as possible. "I'll call him tonight from Missoula," Catherine said as they emerged from the cave into the last light of day. "Set up a meeting for early next week. That gives us a few days to prepare, to get our documentation organized, to make sure we're protected legally." "Protected from what?" "From people who might claim you stole the art, or that you were involved in the original theft, or that you don't have rights to any kind of reward or recognition. We need to establish clearly that you're an innocent discoverer reporting a find, not a participant in any crime." They hiked back toward Coldwater Junction in gathering darkness, using headlamps to navigate the familiar trail. Marcus found himself thinking about what came next, about FBI agents and media attention and lawyers and complications he couldn't begin to imagine. His simple life, the one he'd built so carefully in the aftermath of loss, was about to become very complicated. But underneath the anxiety, there was something else. A sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before the accident. He was doing something that mattered, something that would affect people he'd never meet, something his daughter would have understood and approved of. That had to count for something. They reached the truck after midnight, exhausted and stumbling. Catherine fell asleep almost immediately, curled awkwardly in the passenger seat. Marcus sat behind the wheel, not starting the engine, looking at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, in a cave known for ghosts and superstition, sat $380 million in stolen art. And in a few days, the world was going to know about it. His world, the quiet, isolated world he'd built, was about to end. Marcus started the truck and began the long drive back to Missoula, carrying Catherine and the secret that was about to stop being secret, toward a future he couldn't predict, but had chosen anyway. The next morning, in a hotel room that felt too clean and too bright after weeks in the wilderness, Marcus listened to Catherine's side of a phone conversation that would change everything. She'd called her FBI contact, Special Agent Thomas Chen, who apparently specialized in art crimes and had been with the Bureau for over 20 years. Marcus could only hear Catherine's responses, but he could infer enough. Surprise on Chen's end, skepticism, growing interest, and finally complete professional attention. "Yes, I've seen it myself," Catherine was saying. "Multiple pieces documented with photographs. I can verify authenticity on at least 30 items personally, and the rest match known stolen pieces from the period." A pause. "No, he's not looking for reward money. He wants to return everything to the proper institutions." Another pause, longer this time. "Because he's a good man who found something that doesn't belong to him and wants to do the right thing. Novel concept, I know." She listened for several minutes, making occasional notes, then finally said, "Wednesday works. We can meet you in Missoula. But Agent Chen, I need your word that this gets handled with discretion until we're ready to go public. My client's privacy is paramount." Client, Marcus noticed. Catherine was already establishing boundaries, creating professional distance that might protect him. The call ended, and Catherine turned to Marcus with an expression that managed to be both excited and apprehensive. "He's in. Flying out from Boston on Tuesday, wants to see the site on Wednesday. He's bringing a small team, authentication experts, and documentation specialists. Once they verify what we have, the full machinery of federal law enforcement gets involved." What does that mean exactly? It means agents, lots of them. Crime scene techs, art recovery specialists, probably representatives from Interpol and various museums. It means press conferences and media management and legal proceedings. It means your life becomes public property for a while. She sat down across from him. "Last chance to walk away, Marcus. We can call Chen back. Say it was a false alarm and you disappear back into your mountains. No one would ever know." Marcus thought about it. Really thought about it. Thought about his cabin and his trap lines and the silence that had kept him sane for over a decade. Thought about what he'd be giving up, the peace he'd fought so hard to achieve. Then he thought about a 7-year-old girl who'd believed the world was fundamentally good and that people should help each other. "No," he said. "We do this. We see it through." The days between Catherine's call and Agent Chen's arrival felt both endless and too short. Marcus and Catherine worked on documentation, organizing the photographs and notes into a comprehensive file that told the story of his discovery without unnecessary embellishment. Catherine coached him on what to say and what not to say, how to present himself as credible without seeming rehearsed. "Just tell the truth," she advised. "You're not a criminal. You're not trying to profit. You just found something and want to return it. That simplicity is your best protection." Agent Thomas Chen arrived on a Tuesday evening flight, accompanied by 2 other people, a woman Catherine recognized as a prominent art authenticator from the Smithsonian, and a man introduced simply as technical support, which Marcus assumed meant some kind of documentation or security specialist. They met at the same diner where Marcus and Catherine had talked days earlier. Chen was younger than Marcus expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he took his work very seriously. He listened to Marcus's story without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a tablet, his expression giving away nothing. When Marcus finished, Chen asked the obvious question, "Why should I believe you?" Catherine slid a folder across the table. "Because we have documentation, photographs, detailed inventory, provenance files found at the site. Look at these and tell me they're fabricated." Chen looked through the folder methodically, his expression shifting from skeptical to interested to something approaching stunned. "If these are real, if you've actually found these pieces, this changes everything. The Gardner theft alone has been the Bureau's white whale for 50 years. They're real," Marcus said quietly, "and I can take you there tomorrow." The hike to Raven's Hollow with 4 additional people was slower and more complicated than Marcus's previous trips. Chen's team brought equipment, cameras and testing materials and evidence collection kits, all of which had to be hauled through terrain that wasn't designed for easy access. Marcus led the way, feeling strange about bringing outsiders into the secret he'd carried alone for weeks. When they reached the cave and descended into the main cavern, Chen's professional composure cracked. "Holy hell," he whispered, sweeping his flashlight across the rows of crates. "This is real. This is actually real." The authenticator, a woman named Dr. Melissa Foster, immediately went to work examining pieces with professional efficiency. She used specialized lighting, took detailed photographs, made notes in technical language Marcus didn't understand. After 2 hours, she looked at Chen and said simply, "It's legitimate. Everything I've examined matches known stolen pieces. The preservation is remarkable, and several of these items have been presumed destroyed for decades." Chen pulled out a satellite phone, the only kind that worked this deep in the wilderness, and made a call. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but he caught enough. Authorization requested, teams mobilizing, resources being allocated. The machinery was starting to turn, and there would be no stopping it now. That evening, as they hiked back down to Coldwater Junction, where vehicles were waiting, Chen walked beside Marcus. "I need you to understand what happens next," the agent said. "This site becomes a federal crime scene. We'll have agents stationed here 24/7 until everything's been recovered and documented. You'll be asked to give formal statements, probably multiple times. There will be media attention once this goes public, significant attention. Your life is about to change dramatically." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm ready." Chen studied him in the fading light. "Why? You could have kept this quiet, sold pieces gradually, made yourself rich. Why give it up?" Marcus looked back toward the mountains where Raven's Hollow waited in darkness. "Because it was never mine to keep. And because I've spent 11 years running from responsibility, from connection, from anything that mattered, maybe it's time to stop running." That's unexpectedly philosophical for a guy who lives in a cabin without electricity. "I've had a lot of time to think." They reached the vehicles, and Chen's team immediately began organizing next steps. Additional agents would arrive by morning, security would be established, recovery operations would begin within 48 hours. Marcus listened to the planning with a sense of detachment, like he was hearing about someone else's life. Catherine pulled him aside while the FBI agents were conferring. "You okay?" "I don't know. I think so. It doesn't feel real yet." "It will, probably around the time your face ends up on national news." She smiled slightly. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. This is the right thing, and I know it's not easy." "Sarah would have liked you," Marcus said. "My daughter. She had your same faith that people should be good." "I wish I could have known her better. I wish a lot of things had been different." "Me too." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the agents work, watching the sun set behind mountains that held secrets finally coming to light. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, for just a few more hours, Marcus Webb was still the man who'd walked away from the world, before becoming the man who'd found something too important to keep hidden. The press conference was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the FBI field office in Missoula, and Marcus had never been more uncomfortable in his life. He sat in a small room while Catherine helped him adjust a tie he'd borrowed and didn't know how to knot properly, listening to the murmur of reporters gathering in the adjacent conference room. "You don't have to say much," Catherine reminded him for the 10th time. "Agent Chen will handle most of it. You just need to confirm the basic facts. You found the cave while seeking shelter from a storm. You recognized the items as potentially stolen. You reported it to authorities. Simple, straightforward, honest. What if they ask about why I was in the mountains alone, about my past? Then you tell them it's personal and not relevant to the discovery. You're allowed to have boundaries, Marcus. You're the hero in this story, not the subject of an investigation." Hero. The word felt wrong in Marcus's mouth, uncomfortable and ill-fitting. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who'd made the only choice that let him sleep at night. Agent Chen appeared in the doorway, looking crisp and official in his suit. "We're ready. Remember, this is going to be controlled chaos. We've got representatives from 12 different museums, 3 insurance companies, Interpol, and about 40 journalists. It's going to be intense, but we'll get through it." Marcus followed him out into a hallway that led to the conference room. Through the doorway, he could see lights, cameras, a podium bristling with microphones. His stomach clenched, every instinct screaming at him to turn and run, to disappear back into the wilderness where things made sense and no one wanted anything from him. But Catherine was beside him, her hand briefly touching his elbow in encouragement. And then they were walking into the room and the cameras were turning toward him, and there was no going back. The conference lasted 90 minutes. Agent Chen spoke first, laying out the basic facts. The discovery of a cache containing an estimated 392 pieces of stolen art, valued at approximately $380 million. The pieces included items from the 1974 Gardner Museum heist, the 1971 theft from the Metropolitan Museum, and at least 15 other high-profile robberies spanning from 1968 to 1977. Then Chen introduced Marcus, and the room erupted with shouted questions. Marcus stepped to the podium, his hands gripping the edges to keep them from shaking, and read from a prepared statement Catherine had helped him write. "My name is Marcus Webb. 3 weeks ago, I was caught in a blizzard and took shelter in a cave I'd been told to avoid. What I found there wasn't supernatural or cursed. It was art, hundreds of pieces, carefully preserved and hidden away. I'm not an expert. I'm just a man who recognized that what I'd found didn't belong to me. So I contacted someone who could help, and together we brought it to the FBI's attention. I don't want money or recognition. I just want these pieces to go back where they belong, where people can see them and appreciate them the way they were meant to be appreciated. Thank you." The questions came like a flood. How did he know the art was stolen? Had he taken anything? Why did it take him weeks to report it? Was he involved in the original thefts? Marcus answered what he could, deflected what he couldn't, and tried to ignore the camera flashes that made his eyes water. One reporter, a woman from the New York Times, asked the question Marcus had been dreading. "Mr. Webb, background checks show you disappeared from public life 11 years ago after a family tragedy. Can you talk about how that experience influenced your decision to report this find rather than keep it?" Marcus looked at Catherine, who gave him a small nod. He turned back to the reporter and spoke slowly, carefully. "I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident in 2013. After that, I needed to step away from the world for a while. The mountains gave me space to grieve and heal. When I found this cache, I thought about what my daughter would want me to do. She was 7 when she died, and she believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard. This was hard, but it was right. That's all I want to say about my personal life." The room went quiet for a moment, respectful silence. Then the questions resumed. But something had shifted. The tone became less aggressive, more curious. Marcus was no longer just a man who'd found stolen art. He was a grieving father who'd chosen honor over profit, and that narrative was apparently more compelling than simple greed. After the conference, Marcus was shuffled into a series of smaller meetings. Representatives from various museums wanted to thank him personally, to shake his hand and express gratitude for pieces they'd thought were lost forever. The director of the Gardner Museum, a distinguished woman in her 60s, actually cried when she saw photographs of the recovered Vermeer. "We've had an empty frame on the wall for 50 years, she told Marcus, a reminder of what was taken from us. Now we can finally fill it. You've given us back part of our history." An insurance investigator was less emotional but no less impressed. "Mr. Webb, the companies I represent paid out over $60 million in claims for these pieces back in the 70s and 80s. Your decision to report this rather than attempt to sell it saves us millions in additional investigation costs and potential legal fees. If you change your mind about accepting a finder's fee, please let us know." Marcus shook his head. "I don't want money. I want the art to go home." By evening, he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Catherine found him sitting alone in the hotel lobby, staring at nothing, and sat down beside him without speaking. After a few minutes, she said quietly, "You did good today, really good. You gave them their story, controlled the narrative, established yourself as credible. The hard part is over." "That was the hard part? Because it felt like just the beginning." "Okay, fair. The hard part of today is over. Tomorrow brings new hard parts." Marcus almost smiled. "What happens now?" "Now the recovery operation goes into full swing. FBI teams are already at the cave, establishing security and beginning documentation. Over the next few weeks, every piece will be photographed, catalogued, authenticated, and carefully transported to secure facilities. You'll probably need to give more statements, answer more questions. There might be legal challenges from various parties claiming ownership. It's going to be messy and complicated and take years to fully resolve." "And me? What do I do?" Catherine turned to look at him directly. "That's up to you. You could go back to your cabin, retreat into the mountains, try to reclaim your quiet life. Or you could stay engaged, be part of the recovery process, maybe even help with the eventual museum exhibitions. Use your platform to talk about art preservation or mental health or whatever matters to you. You have options now, Marcus. More than you've had in a long time." Marcus thought about his cabin, about the silence and the solitude that had sustained him for over a decade. It still called to him, that simplicity, that separation from a world that demanded too much and gave too little. But he also thought about the Gardner Museum director's tears, about the idea that empty frames might finally be filled, about his daughter's belief in doing right even when it cost you. "I think," he said slowly, "I think I want to see it through, at least the recovery part. Make sure everything gets where it's supposed to go. After that, maybe I'll figure out what comes next." "That sounds reasonable, and Marcus, you won't be doing it alone. I'm going to be involved in the authentication and provenance research, probably for the next year at least. We'll be seeing a lot of each other. I can live with that." The recovery operation took 6 weeks. Marcus returned to the mountains, but not to isolation. His cabin became a waypoint for FBI agents and museum curators making their way to and from Ravens Hollow. He guided teams through the terrain, helped with logistics, answered endless questions about exactly where and how he'd found specific pieces. Agent Chen became a regular visitor, updating Marcus on progress and occasionally asking for his input on details only Marcus had witnessed. They developed an unlikely friendship, the federal agent and the hermit, bonding over shared appreciation for doing things properly and completely. "You know," Chen said one evening as they sat on Marcus's small porch watching the sunset, "in 23 years with the Bureau, I've worked hundreds of cases. But this is the one I'll tell my grandkids about. The biggest art recovery in American history, solved because one guy chose a cave at random during a blizzard and then chose to do the right thing. It's almost absurdly improbable." "Luck," Marcus said. "Maybe. Or maybe the universe needed this stuff found and you were in the right place at the right time. I'm not usually spiritual, but this case makes me wonder." The recovery itself was meticulous and painstaking. Each piece was photographed in situ, carefully packed using museum-quality materials, and transported under armed guard to secure facilities. Art experts from around the world descended on Montana, examining paintings and sculptures with the kind of reverent attention usually reserved for religious artifacts. Dr. Foster, the Smithsonian authenticator who'd been part of Chen's initial team, spent 3 days in the cave examining a single Rembrandt sketch using specialized equipment to verify age, materials, and technique. When she finally emerged, she looked exhausted and elated. "It's genuine," she told the assembled team. "Not just genuine, but in better condition than it was when it was stolen. Whoever preserved these pieces knew exactly what they were doing. The climate in that cave, the careful wrapping, even the positioning of the crates to minimize stress on the items, it was all perfectly calculated." Joseph Raines might have been a thief, but he understood conservation. Marcus found himself thinking about Raines often during those weeks. About a man who'd spent his life stealing beauty and then buried it, where no one, including himself, could enjoy it. There was something tragic about that. Something that spoke to a kind of tortured morality Marcus understood better than he wanted to admit. Raines had drawn lines, made choices that cost him everything, and died alone with his secrets. Not so different from Marcus, really, except Marcus had been given a chance to make different choices. The media attention was relentless for the first few weeks, then gradually faded as other stories captured public attention. Marcus gave no additional interviews, released no statements, and refused every book deal and movie offer that came his way. His lawyer, a sharp woman from Missoula that Catherine had recommended, handled all requests with the same firm response. "Mr. Webb wishes to maintain his privacy. No comment." But some things couldn't be avoided. 2 months after the press conference, Marcus received a certified letter from the state of Massachusetts. Inside was a formal commendation from the governor, thanking him for his role in recovering the Gardner Museum pieces. There was also a check, a finder's fee authorized by the museum's board of trustees, $2 million. Marcus stared at the check for a long time, feeling the weight of numbers that still didn't seem real. $2 million. More money than he'd earn in 10 lifetimes living the way he'd been living. Money that could buy comfort, security, anything he wanted. He called Catherine. "They sent me money." "I know. The Gardner Museum announced it yesterday. It's their way of saying thank you." "I didn't want money. I told them that." "I know you did. But Marcus, accepting it doesn't make you a bad person. You could do a lot of good with $2 million. Donate it, invest it in causes you care about, set up scholarships in your daughter's name, or keep it and buy yourself some comfort in your old age. Any of those choices would be okay." Marcus looked around his cabin at the simple life he'd built with his own hands. "What would you do?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I'd keep some for security, because being poor when you're old is terrifying, and I'd use the rest to honor the people I've lost. Maybe that means a scholarship fund. Maybe that means donating to museums so more people can experience art. Maybe it means something else entirely. But I'd make it mean something." After they hung up, Marcus sat at his small table and thought about his wife and daughter, about the future they should have had and the hole their absence had left in the world. He thought about art that had been hidden for 40 years and was now being returned to the light. He thought about doing the right thing even when it cost you, and about the fact that sometimes doing right actually gave you something back. He deposited the check and started making plans. 6 months after the initial discovery, the first pieces began returning to their home museums. The Gardner Museum organized a massive exhibition featuring all their recovered works, and they invited Marcus to the opening. He almost declined. The idea of traveling to Boston and facing crowds and attention made his chest tight, but Catherine convinced him. "These paintings have been waiting 50 years to come home," she said. "Don't you want to see them where they belong? Not in a cave or a storage facility, but on a wall where people can actually experience them." So Marcus found himself on a plane for the first time in over a decade, wearing a suit Catherine had helped him buy, flying toward a city he'd never visited for an event he couldn't quite believe was happening. Catherine met him at the airport, and together they took a cab to the museum. The Gardner was smaller than Marcus expected, an elegant building designed to look like a Venetian palace. Inside, the walls were filled with art spanning centuries, and at the center of the main gallery, spotlit and gleaming, was the Vermeer, Girl reading a letter at an open window, the painting Catherine had written her dissertation about, the one that had been presumed destroyed for over 40 years. Marcus stood in front of it, surrounded by museum donors and art historians and journalists, and felt something shift in his chest. The painting was beautiful, luminous and intimate, a frozen moment of ordinary life rendered extraordinary by skill and vision. And people were seeing it, experiencing it, being moved by it. This was what art was supposed to do: connect, inspire, remind people that beauty existed even in simple moments. The museum director found him during the reception, pressed a glass of champagne into his hand that Marcus had no intention of drinking, and introduced him to seemingly everyone in Boston who cared about art. They thanked him, praised him, told him how his discovery had changed the landscape of art history. Marcus nodded and smiled and felt profoundly out of place, but also, for the first time in a very long time, like he was part of something larger than himself. Later, after the crowds had thinned and the museum was closing, Catherine found him sitting alone in front of the Vermeer. She sat beside him without speaking, both of them looking at the painting in comfortable silence. "Thank you," Marcus said eventually, "for pushing me to report this, for helping me navigate everything that came after. I couldn't have done this alone." "You could have," Catherine said, "but I'm glad you didn't have to. And Marcus, your wife would be proud of you. Sarah would be proud. They'd want you to know that." Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes, the first he'd allowed himself to shed in public in over a decade. "I hope so. God, I hope so." They sat together as the museum lights dimmed, two people connected by loss and art, and the choice to do something difficult because it was right. Outside, Boston hummed with life, indifferent and ongoing. But in this quiet gallery, in front of a painting that had survived theft and decades in darkness to finally come home, Marcus Webb felt something he hadn't felt since before the accident: peace. The legal proceedings took 18 months to fully resolve. Various insurance companies, museums, and private collectors submitted claims on different pieces from the cache. International treaties had to be consulted, ownership disputes arbitrated, provenance verified through layers of documentation that sometimes stretched back centuries. Marcus attended some of the hearings, mainly when his testimony about the discovery was required, but he left most of the legal maneuvering to lawyers who understood the complexities better than he ever would. Catherine kept him updated on progress, calling every few weeks with news about which pieces had been allocated to which institutions. "The Rembrandt sketches are going back to Amsterdam," she reported in one call. "The Rodin sculptures are being split between Paris and New York. That Byzantine mosaic you found, the one we thought might be from a destroyed monastery? Turns out it was stolen from a private collection in Athens in 1972. The family is beside themselves. They never thought they'd see it again." Each piece had a story, a history of creation and theft and recovery. Marcus found himself oddly invested in these stories, wanting to know where everything ended up, hoping that the art found homes where it would be appreciated and preserved. The hardest case was the handful of pieces that couldn't be definitively attributed to any known theft. These items, mostly smaller sculptures and ancient artifacts, had no clear provenance prior to appearing in Joseph Raines's cache. After lengthy deliberation, they were assigned to various museums on long-term loan, available for study and display, but held in a kind of legal limbo until ownership could be established. Through it all, Marcus's life slowly found a new normal. He kept his cabin but spent less time isolated in it. He volunteered at a small museum in Missoula, helping with preservation work and occasionally giving talks to school groups about the importance of protecting cultural heritage. He was awkward at first, uncomfortable with attention and unsure how to talk to children, but gradually he found his rhythm. One afternoon, a girl about 7 years old asked him why he'd given the paintings back instead of keeping them. Marcus knelt down to her level and said, "Because they weren't mine, and because I think beautiful things should be shared, not hidden. Does that make sense?" She nodded seriously. "My mum says you're a hero. I'm not a hero, I just did what I thought was right." "That's what heroes do," she said with the absolute certainty of childhood, and Marcus found himself blinking back tears for the second time in a year. He used part of the museum's finder's fee to establish a scholarship fund in his daughter's name, supporting students studying art history or conservation. Another portion went to funding mental health services for people dealing with grief, because Marcus understood now that his decade of isolation, while necessary for him, wasn't the only path through loss. Some people needed connection, needed help, needed to be told that healing was possible even when it felt impossible. He kept enough for himself to be comfortable, to fix up his cabin properly and maybe buy a reliable truck, to know that he wouldn't have to worry about money in his old age. But the bulk of it, over $1 million, went toward causes that honored the people he'd lost and the art he'd found. Catherine became a regular presence in his life, visiting Montana several times a year, calling weekly to talk about her research or his volunteer work or nothing in particular. They were friends. Genuine friends, connected by shared experience and mutual respect. Sometimes Marcus thought there might be something more there, some possibility of relationship beyond friendship. But he wasn't ready for that, and wasn't sure he ever would be. Catherine seemed to understand, seemed content with what they had. 2 years after the initial discovery, all the legal proceedings were finally concluded. Every piece from Raven's Hollow had been allocated, authenticated, and delivered to its destination. The cave itself had been studied extensively by geologists and archaeologists, then quietly sealed by the Forest Service to prevent trophy hunters or curiosity seekers from damaging the site. Agent Chen called to give Marcus the news. It's done. Every piece accounted for, every claim resolved. The Gardner Museum is planning a permanent exhibition about the theft and recovery, and they want to include your story. They're asking permission to use your name and likeness. Marcus considered. 2 years ago, he would have refused immediately, would have insisted on anonymity at any cost, but he'd changed, or maybe the world had changed his relationship with it. Okay, he said. They can use my name, but I want them to include information about Joseph Raines too, not to glorify him, but to tell the complete story. He stole these pieces, but he also preserved them. That complexity matters. I'll pass that along. And Marcus, it's been an honor working with you. This case, it reminded me why I got into this work in the first place. Not for the bureaucracy or the paperwork, but for moments like seeing that Vermeer back on the wall where it belongs. Thank you for that. After they hung up, Marcus walked outside and looked toward the mountains where Raven's Hollow waited, sealed and silent once again. The cave had kept its secret for over 40 years, had protected treasures through storms and seasons and the slow erosion of time. And then it had released those secrets to someone who would treat them with the care they deserved. He thought about the man who'd hidden those treasures, about Joseph Raines's note, better lost than sold to men worse than me. Raines had made choices Marcus understood, had drawn lines, and lived with the consequences. In the end, his legacy wasn't the theft, but the preservation, wasn't the crime, but the care he'd taken to protect what he'd stolen until it could somehow find its way home. Marcus had been the instrument of that homecoming, the unlikely bridge between theft and recovery. He hadn't sought that role, hadn't wanted the responsibility or attention that came with it. But he'd accepted it, had seen it through, and in the process had found something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose. That evening, Marcus sat at his small table and wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific, just words he needed to say, thoughts he needed to express. He wrote about the accident that had shattered his life, about the 11 years he'd spent hiding in the mountains, about a storm and a cave and a choice that had changed everything. He wrote about his daughter, about the gap-toothed girl who'd believed in doing right, and how her memory had guided him when he didn't know which way to turn. He wrote about art and beauty and the responsibility of preserving things that mattered. He wrote about loss and healing and the slow, difficult work of rejoining the world after trauma had torn you away from it. And he wrote about hope, about the possibility that even broken things could be repaired, that even lost things could be found, that even people who'd given up on themselves could discover they still had something to give. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it in a waterproof bag. Then he hiked to the lightning-struck pine where he'd buried his first notes about the discovery, dug up that original notebook, and replaced it with the letter. Someday, maybe, someone would find it. Or maybe the forest would claim it, and his words would return to the earth that had sheltered him. Either way felt right. Marcus Webb had come to these mountains 11 years ago, looking for nothing except silence and solitude. He'd found both, and they'd saved him in the way he'd needed saving. But the mountains had also given him something unexpected, a chance to matter again, to make choices that affected the world beyond his small piece of it, to be more than a man hiding from his past. He'd taken that chance. He'd opened the cave, reported the find, faced the media and the questions and the complicated aftermath. He'd chosen transparency over profit, community over isolation, purpose over comfort. And in making those choices, he'd discovered that healing didn't mean forgetting, that moving forward didn't dishonor what you'd lost, that it was possible to carry grief and still build something new. The art had found its way home, and in helping it get there, Marcus had found his way back to something like hope. Anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to choose right over easy, if they're willing to carry the weight of responsibility even when it costs them everything they thought they wanted. Marcus Webb had made that choice in a cave during a storm, and it had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined, touching museums and families and strangers around the world. As the sun set over the Montana wilderness, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Marcus sat on his porch and allowed himself to imagine a future. Maybe he'd keep volunteering at the museum, keep giving talks to kids who asked hard questions. Maybe he'd write a book about his experience, not for fame, but to help other people understand that loss doesn't have to be the end of your story. Maybe he'd even let Catherine visit more often, let her into the life he'd built, risk the vulnerability of real connection. The possibilities stretched before him, uncertain but not frightening, full of potential he'd thought he'd lost forever. His daughter would be 26 now, old enough to understand the choices he'd made, the years he'd spent alone, the discovery that had brought him back to the world. He hoped she'd understand, hoped she'd forgive the years he'd been absent even from his own life, hoped she'd recognize the man he was trying to become as someone worthy of the love she'd given so freely. The mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping their remaining secrets the way they'd kept Raven's Hollow's fortune until the right person stumbled through the door. Marcus was part of those mountains now, part of their story, just as they were part of his. He'd come here broken, and they'd given him space to exist. He'd left here changed, and they'd given him a gift that transformed not just his life, but countless others. That was worth something. That meant something. And for a man who'd spent over a decade believing his life no longer meant anything at all, that was more than he'd ever thought to hope for. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of courage, discovery, and the choices that define who we become. Click to continue the journey, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe doing the right thing always matters, even when it costs you everything.